former board member, is presenting for the Vancouver Jung Society on climate change. And I think I did send a general emailing about that. But if anyone is interested in joining that tomorrow night, as Lisa and I will be, send word, and I'll send the link out. That's a paying thing. They ask for $20 for participation.
Okay, so like I said, we are recording this, but we'll have to see whether it gets posted or not. We might decide not to put it up on the public YouTube channel, but it will be there unlisted if anybody wants to rewatch it.
So the meaning of our gatherings is comprised by all of you, by each and all of you. So good to have you all here. Of course, many of the flock this evening are here often, and it's always good to be together. Whenever folks choose to come or are able to come, our purpose is to be together and to carry on our presentations and discussions. And as friends of Sege Jung that we are. So as we were contemplating our program for this trimester, and we're always looking for suggestions that anyone has of any topic. And please see the newsletter for what is coming up, including the probability of moving into a new book discussion with Mara-Louise von Franz and projection and recollection in Jungian psychology. And if you are interested in that discussion, it would be good to get the book. It'll be it's a very readable book. It's a challenging book, but in this process of thinking about programs for this trimester, I had read somewhere, and as probably most of us have at one moment or another, but I read some text on some posting in the news deluge flow, the framing, the rubric mob mentality. And it just rang my bell that this term was used in some text, some posting. Like maybe some of you, I also reach the point of overload almost every day of just saying, that's just all that I can take in today. I simply can't take in any more today. And I move along. But at any rate, that phrase rang my bell, which was, well, you know, Jung has something to say about this. And why not have a discussion? But also not only hanging there in abstraction, but that the notion of mob mentality, I think, is on the minds of lots of us, and rightly so, as to what that is, not only in our present experience and whatever politically is happening in our world today, but also, of course, the past, but also the future, to use those temporic framings. So, and then I thought, well, you know, not to have a formal presentation, which I'm not going to be doing, a formal presentation on this, but rather I think just to have a discussion and go with a selection of quotes from Jung, which I sent out and assembled. They're very fertile, all of these quotes. I have to add one more thing. I really have to bring Jean Gebser to the table. I think most of the folks here tonight have some sense of the basic modeling of Jean Gebser. But it's so pertinent that from the beginning to at least state that, because for me, I would irresistibly be referring to it as we move along. But in briefest review, Gebser's modeling of the structures of consciousness. Again, we've had an entire conference, a major conference, in 2019 here at Asilomar on the Monterey Peninsula of Gebser Jung. And it was really a momentous occasion for some of us to look at how it is profitable to hold Gebser and Jung together. But in tonight's discussion, Gebser speaks of 5 structures, and these have a sequentiality, although Gebser emphasizes that it's wrong to view this sequentiality as a simple developmental sequence or a chronological sequence or some sort of grand framework for analyzing history. But rather, in the consciousness of each of us, Gebser describes an archaic level of consciousness, which for the moment, let's just associate with our basic biophysical functions, all those elements of our awareness of which we are not aware of, basic brain stem functions, the archaic consciousness. It is undifferentiated. But from the archaic arises the magical or the magic consciousness, which is still there's not a differentiation between subject and object. And we all experience this as infants, shall we say. My 4.5-month-old grandson, I would say, is considerably in the magic phase where there's no causality or sequentiality, particularly in his experience. All these things are forming. I would say something of a world of surprise. There's lots of surprise in his life. And elements of his life and into my own grandchildren up to age 2 and then on upward, the sense of magic and the awareing of magic that is truly magical is, and there is an efficient magic to this. There's nothing wrong with it. However, as we continue to mature, the magic gives way to the mythic, and the magic, if it persists, becomes deficient or unmaking. If it transitions successfully into the mythic, then the efficient magic can continue, as it does with all of us, or it can with all of us, through the mythic, which also has a very efficient aspect. That's more where my 2-year-old grandson and 5-year-old granddaughter are. It's more, you might say, mythically oriented. They're not looking for rational causes so much, but there's an efficient mythic, the stories, the tales, the rhythms, the rhymes. And this is also efficient until the summons to mental consciousness, in which case the mythic can also become deficient. It can become stuck. And the mental arises, which is very important. The basis of our educational system is basically to converge with children at the rise of the mythic, rather the mental phase. And of course, a hazard of Western culture in particular is to say that the mental phase is the only phase that matters, and the mythic is to be rejected or destroyed. The corollaries here with depth psychology are just so transparent, I feel. But the mental, as Gebser says, also becomes deficient when it has the arrogant presumption that all of consciousness is rational. that the real is the rational, and that anything that is not rational is not real. Gebser describes that as the deficient rational. And he describes it as a disease that is very destructive in modern civilization, shall we say. I'm not trying to write an essay here. I'm just trying to get this basic model out for you. The integral consciousness is the awareing that all these structures are at work with all of us all the time, emergent in varying dimensionalities. So I think that's enough. That's enough of Gebser for now. But at least if it does come up, and I know it will come up with me when we go into what Jung has to say, which is indeed our focus. So from the get-go, with this first quote, well, actually, I was pondering that maybe before we actually take up the quotes, you tell me what you think, that I was going to ask each of you if you wished to either state affirmatively or negatively that you personally, directly, in your lived experience, not mediated, but have experienced mob mentality, an episode of mob mentality. And if so, what that experience was. I have really, what came to my mind, 2 episodes of mob mentality that I have experienced directly, immediately in, shall we say, real time. And I can state those. Does anyone else want to speak to whether you have such an experience? I think that might ground this discussion. I'll prime the pump here to just, and we did that back in Tennessee where I grew up. We actually did prime pumps. And I really know what that means. Anyway, the first that came to my mind today thinking about it, and this was pretty slight, but I think it was actual, was back home in Tennessee in 1964. So I was 14 years old. Barry Goldwater made a campaign stop at the local airport. And us kids were given the day off to go out and to see Barry Goldwater if we wanted to. John F. Kennedy had been there in 1960, but I was only 10 then, and I missed that occasion. But at any rate, Goldwater came in 1964. And the plane landed, and Goldwater got off the plane and was put in a car. And of course, this was a long time ago. But the crowd and a bunch of us kids, we just basically rushed Goldwater's car. And I remember that feeling of like, I didn't plan to be a part of this. I didn't even feel any particularized motivation to do it, but it just arose. It was just the whole crowd started rushing Goldwater's car, a convertible, from the airplane to the speaker stand. And I remember to this day the look on Barry Goldwater's face, which was a certain degree of, let's say, concern as to what we were all doing. But at any rate, he proceeded safely to the speaker stand and gave his speech. So that was episode number 1. Episode number 2 was later at Northwestern University, where I was an undergraduate. And at the time, as many of you can relate, going on in Chicago was the trial of the Chicago 7. And a group of the seven had come to be on a panel in an auditorium there at Northwestern. And this included William Kunstler, the attorney, and some of the names amongst the seven, but it didn't include the major star. It didn't include Jerry Rubin. But it was some of the lesser names. But at any rate, there was a panel of the Chicago Seven. And there in the auditorium, there arose a sort of a chanting. And as the speaking would be going on, there were lots of, right on, right on, right on. And it had a very powerful energy. And a very good friend of mine who had gone to this event with me, he turned to me and he said, and I was sort of mystified by this energy field. I had other experiences of mystifying energy fields in that era, but we'll stick with this one. Because my friend turned to me and said, wow, he said, this is just like a Nazi rally. And it absolutely shook me to the marrow of my bones because, this was a very simple statement on his part of immediate experience. And, but my immediate feeling was, yeah, you're right. This feels like something going on. There's a rally and there's something happening here. And I'm right here in the middle of it. I didn't really feel drawn to surrender to it. I didn't have the perspective that he brought to it until he brought to it. But once he brought that statement to me, I was completely transformed and I was no longer into it. I was no longer into the situation. I stayed. And, Bill Kunstler seemed to be somewhat bemused by the whole situation. Kunstler was an interesting figure. A play written a few years ago about that. And then there was the film with the script written by, who is it, Lisa? The screenwriter.
Aaron Sorkin.
Yeah, he did that. And there was a film made of this. I thought it was a pretty well-made film. And I've certainly talked with a lot of people from that era who were in Chicago at the time of the Chicago riots. But I'm going to close that statement at this point because I don't have direct anecdotes. Does anyone else have a direct anecdote of feelings of the sort I've just described? Okay.
Well, I have a question.
Okay.
Whether this kind of thing counts. Mass. I was raised Catholic and, there are all of these, the priest says this and then the congregation responds and I never liked those, you have to, there's the profession of faith that you have to say at every mass. And then there's certain masses where you kind of reenact the crucifixion and everybody has to, say, crucify him. And I never liked doing that. Whether, it was, there's something about I don't know, rituals that to me invokes mob mentality. And I can see an efficient form of such rituals, like I've made the case that I think the Thunder Perfect Mind was used in a ritual setting, and I think that was to, elevate one's consciousness. But would you put such things as church services and those kinds of call and response in in this category of mob mentality?
I personally would. Are you hearing me? It's not showing it. Yeah, yeah. I personally would, and I think your point is very, very important. I thank you for adding it. Growing up in the Southern Baptist culture that I did, I certainly could move into revivals, tent revivals that I attended, and many, many other religious experiences where I would say, yes, that is certainly in the borderline area that you're describing. And I think you add a very important point for us to keep in our context as our conversation may expand in various directions. Now, again, at least for the moment, we're going to dwell not with mediated experiences. Intrinsically, inevitably, we're going to get into that. And that is our experiences of mob mentality, shall we say, from observing it through a medium, but we were not directly present. Anyway, Eileen, comment?
Well, I was going to give you a mediative one, but
It's okay, go ahead.
Well, rock concerts. I had reason to look at a rock concert about 2 years ago, and it really was dangerous and horrifying how you had this extraordinarily large crowd, and then members of the crowd go to in the center of the crowd. So the mass of the crowd moves back, and then there's a melee in the center where people dance. Women are raised up in the air and carried from a man to another man. This all of this kind of what looks like orgiastic a free fall. And then the band, of course, is enabling, encouraging this, and it looks so extremely dangerous. And then I read, I think it was about a couple months ago, about somebody that got killed, or more than one, maybe 4 or 5 people, just because the mob got so wild. There was a stampede that these young people got killed. So it was pretty an extraordinary thing to watch.
Eileen, John, it brings to mind, I've been to a rock concert and it's been about 20 years. I've been to a rock concert, and I can see Eileen's point of view from having been there, is that I would say not the entire audience was in that state of mind, but a significant portion wanted to touch the performers. I mean, if they could possibly do that, they would be there. And this rushing the stage is that kind of thinking of wanting to, somehow it's magical, John, in that touching the performer it gives them some kind of power that they did not have, or something along those lines. So that's my recollection at the moment of my experience.
Mike.
Yeah, I was in '69. I was a young faculty member at Northern Illinois University. I think about the same time you were in Chicago. And we had a group of radical professors, and there were demonstrations. I think it was the Vietnam War. Major demonstration blocked a federal highway through DeKalb. And the mob, I mean, was really chanting and making a lot of racket and blocking the highway, and the thing was going. But something strange, and that is all the federal troops were on one side of the bridge, the students were on the other, the faculty were in the middle. and the troops started to march. And somehow we all got reason, and everybody ran. I mean, that broke up the mob mentality, is what I'm thinking. It was weird.
I was remembering when around the time of the election when Biden won, just before that, there were these trucks that came, on the freeway on 101 and 1. And so it was just this parade of trucks that nobody could pass, that it was stopping traffic from, even up here, but certainly down in the Bay Area. And just how dangerous that was, because there was a lot of people angry, held up, and the people in the trucks causing the havoc also were all riled up. So that was a dangerous situation.
Doc.
Yeah, my closest I've come to that on a regular basis was Indiana basketball, particularly Indiana University, which off and on for many years. I never did go to a game live. If you just walked by the arena with a game going on, you could, quote, feel the electricity. Over time, when Knight was a coach, all of that energy got away from him. He had to be fired, death threats, the whole bit. And well, anyway, that even high school games, people would get carried away. I call it being carried away. They would do what they would not think about. Were they not in that situation?
That's a very useful term. Thank you. Carried away. Of course, you were a professor there at Indiana at this time.
So. Oh yes, I had students in my class that came there to escape death threats. It was so bad.
Because of the basketball situation.
Yes.
And Bobby Knight. And
yeah, it got to be, is the university going to be run by a board of trustees and faculty, or is it going to be run by a sports mob?
Yeah, there we go. We're really gathering very valuable contributions from everyone.
I think Elena has her hand up.
Okay. Oh yes, Elena, I see that. Thank you.
I hear you're always talking about bigger happenings and events and mob mentality on a big scale. But I have such a feeling sometimes that mob mentality is everywhere, every day. And I'm observing it literally around me. And sometimes, I don't know about you guys, but I meet a lot of people and I feel like I have to be always smart enough to somehow not to trap, like a mouse in a trap. I have many examples on a smaller scale, maybe not important. It's not it has no political nature. It's always about doing for somebody something, or about money, or about, it's kind of like, mostly it's about money. When people try to get some money from you, or when people create situations, so all of a sudden the entire building is starting paying to a super money in order to get the lease renewed, for example. This is for me mob mentality, which is not on a big scale, but it exists around me. Or people who, for example, develop pattern system in order to create money, and it's not a good pattern. If you look at it from above, it's kind of like almost illegal what they do. I have observed it, or I'm literally observing it almost every day.
A little bit of context there, Elena, would be for everyone would be that you are living in New York City, I believe. So that
yeah, maybe that plays a big role. It's a lot here, but yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyone else? Go ahead. Whoever.
Yeah, I was thinking, I agree with Doc. I mean, there's the cases where, in rallies or whatever, I mean, we're all thinking of January 6th, right? I mean, that's, that's kind of the ultimate mob here of the year, the mob of the year, I guess. But I disagree with you, Lisa, in terms of the crucify him part. There's that participation in that mob is so that in that case it puts you in the position of proclaiming something the opposite of what the congregation would ordinarily want to say, and so it kind of opens your mind to a different point of view and putting yourself in the position of the enemy, so to speak. But that's definitely in our history. That's a case of a mob, the mob that crucified Jesus. So, but yeah, I think of sports rallies for sure, and I agree with Elena also that it is all around us. It can be a one-on-one thing where I just am compelled to agree with the person that I'm sitting with, just because I either want them to like me or just want to agree or something like that. I mean, I think that in some sense, that's there's something of the mob mentality that's in that very situation.
It's conformity, right?
Conformity.
Yeah.
We've got a lot on the table here. Absolutely so. Yes, you do, Rob, draw our attention to the fact that this enactment in the Holy Week liturgy of the mob shouting, "Crucify him." I mean, we can take a couple of quantum leaps into the archetypal motif of wanting to grab a piece of the performer on the stage. And we can look in perhaps in another discussion more than tonight into the archetypology of the hero who is to be sacrificed. I mean, this is the basic Dionysian archetype, to destroy the god and to consume the god. So that's certainly operative here too. The emphasis on energy, and always with Jung discussions, we do well to remember Jung's foundational work and statement about looking for the energy in any of our discussions about any of our experiences. Is can we discuss how energy is operating? And that's also a good seminar in itself, psychic energy. But at this point, if we're good, I think, why don't we turn, as was our agreed framework, to to Jung himself. But first, Robin.
Yeah, I just want to mention 2 years ago, I went to the Kumbh Mela in India with 20 million people. And it's a spiritual festival where you go into the Ganges River to evolve your soul, basically. And people are very motivated to get there. And I think I only thought stampede twice. But it didn't feel like, it didn't feel scary to me. It was an energy for sure. And it really only felt like a unified, perhaps, mob once they got to the river's edge, and they were very motivated to get in the water. And there was this big surge of shouting and, running. So I thought it was a good example of something that's maybe, more of an individual mob. Each person has this motivation, but then it kind of gathered energy as it got closer.
Yeah.
Yes, Robin gave us a report on this once upon a time, and in case it slipped past you, she's speaking of a celebration of 20 million people.
Mhm.
Okay. All right. Well, let's turn to. I think the quotes we have here can serve us well as a structuring and connecting with what Dr. Jung is offering us to continue our conversation. The first quote I have, and I'll read it, is actually from the Dictionary of Jungian Analysis, a resource that I much recommend. Does anyone else have this text? Do you have it in front of you, Lisa? I don't need to be reading all of these things.
Yeah.
Someone else could read the first one.
I have it if you want.
Great,
Okay.
great. I'd rather not hear myself so much.
Okay. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
All right. We will take up these statements. So this is the first statement. When the collective is regarded as a reservoir of psychic possibilities, it is a gargantuan force capable of fostering grandiose delusions and mass psychoses. The opposite of individuality, Jung viewed as identification with a collective ideal leading to inflation and ultimately to megalomania.
Okay, we've got some psychological language in there that we may want to spend a little time to unpack. But let me add the next sentence from that entry that because I think I'm going to add this entry continues. Jung believed the real carrier of change to be the individual, since the mass as a whole is incapable of consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
So shall we probe some of this language? When the collective is regarded as a reservoir of psychic possibilities, we have a metaphor there. Reservoir is a metaphor. And then we have the expression psychic possibilities. I mean, what do we mean by that? Well, we can take that up. The authors here are saying it is a gargantuan force. So we have gargantuan. Did that come from Jonathan Swift, Max?
Yeah.
A gargantuan force capable of fostering grandiose delusions and mass psychoses. So we've got that term psychosis to also, at least pause for the moment to say, do we have a satisfactory sense among us of consensus as to what we mean by psychosis? And how do we conceive of a mass psychosis? Max?
Yeah, I would just, I want to ask for a clarification, I think. Do we use mass and collective as interchangeable? Because I think there is a difference between collective and mass or crowd. And then I think there is another differentiation, at least it is in Freud, but I'm sure it's in Jung as well, is between mass as a kind of a temporary entity, something that can happen in a demonstration, and then it will disappear. And then there is a mass psychology that is typical of a church or army. This is Freud, this is not Jung, but I think the distinction is also useful. So there are because the second thing, church or the church or the army, I think is more related to a collective. And then one can include a party as well. That is that I wouldn't say is a mass, is a crowd. So just my clarification is, are we willing to use these two terms as interchangeable, or we want to follow these two different avenues? Because I think there are some differences there. Just that.
I think it's very important to differentiate between those two terms, and Jung as well. For him, no, collective does not equal mass. Mass does not equal collective. And then we also have some scalability here, as you just said. Although collective psychology, which you know is very big with Jung, and is one reason for his summary rejection by so many, is that Jung emphasizes the existence of the collective unconscious. But we do need to differentiate. Now, to my knowledge, the origin of the term mass, as in mass society, by the way, which has nothing to do with the word mass in the church. The word mass in the church has zero to do with the word mass in terms of mass society. And I can tell you a little bit more about that. But at any rate, that's the way it is. Anyway, I think it was Ortega y Gasset who first used the term mass society as a sociological descriptor, or de Tocqueville maybe earlier. So
Le Bon, Freud used Le Bon at the end of 19th century, and Le Bon wrote on masses.
Okay.
And Comte.
Comte
wrote, yeah, he wrote about crowd behavior too.
Yeah. But to speak of mass society, I mean, yes, we can dig there as to, when did this concept emerge, and why did it emerge? Why did we need this expression, the mass, in terms of mass society? I mean, that's a large question right there.
Well, it has some interesting overlaps with physics too. Mass being kind of like weight, but conversely, I mean, what happens in such mass events is more like a field phenomenon.
Oh, that's good. Very interesting. Yeah, we could dig into the etymology of the word mass, and we can make some of those connections even with the word physics, with the realm of physics and field dynamics. I think that's good, and I think that's in accord with Jung also ultimately, and in his discussions with Pauli and other discussions. But if I may, yes.
No, because this is very interesting. At the same time, you have the mass, if you want, as a physical concept, and individuals, 19th century, have been defined as atoms. So you have the atomization of society, atomistic individuals on the one hand, and then you have masses on the other hand. And in a certain way, in sociology, the masses is constituted by atomized individuals.
And you have at the same time Nietzsche talking about the herd.
Yeah.
That same late 19th century. Yeah.
And yes, he had nothing good to say about the herd.
Mentality.
Well, actually, yes, I'm glad you said mentality, because in some ways our discussion has a stated focus on mob mentality.
Yeah.
So in that sense, we're not talking about mass mentality, which is an important discussion that That's just not our stated rubric for the evening. We're talking about mob, and we're talking about a mentality associated with the mob. So I think we've probably, I'm going to, Jung, the opposite of individuality is identification with a collective ideal, which leads to inflation and megalomania, which we can associate with mob. Megalomania means an increase of madness.
Okay, I want to introduce some other, I think, important terms, which go along with that. One being telos, and where did you say here? Collective ideal, an identification with a collective ideal. One could call that a telos. And to go back to the church versus rock concert distinction, in church, I think there is a telos, whereas in rock concerts or protests or sporting events, I don't think there's that same kind of telos. The group does not have necessarily a shared telos. Something is emergent. That's the other word. Something in that large group of atomistic individuals emerges.
Well, let's just walk right along through that to our first statement from Dr. Jung himself. Reader, do we have a reader for the, please?
Oh, well,
Whenever concerns.
okay. You want me to do it? Or?
Somebody.
Okay. Whenever concerns of the collective unconscious become activated, they have a disturbing effect on the conscious mind, and confusion ensues. If the activation is due to the collapse of the individual's hopes and expectations, there is a danger that the collective unconscious may take the place of reality. This state would be pathological. The mental state of the people as a whole might well be compared to a psychosis.
So here we do have Jung speaking of the collective unconscious. And of course, right away, we have the dilemma that to speak of the unconscious, we are speaking of what is unknown and unknowable about ourselves. So when we can stay with field dynamics, I think that's good, and energy, when concerns of the collective unconscious become activated, they have a disturbing effect on the conscious mind, and confusion ensues. And then he goes on with if this is happening with a collapse of individual hopes and expectations, then the collective, the forces, the dynamics of the collective unconscious may, to use his words in the translation, may take the place of reality. This is a very common expression, isn't it? I mean, it's a common expression every day in the news feeds of saying a particular group has lost touch with reality. And that's a part of what Jung is saying, particularly if it's due to the collapse of individual hopes and expectations. This state would be pathological, which means, a disease, an illness. And the mental state of the people caught up in this, it might be well compared to a psychosis.
Yes, I'm reminded of something I read about Jung maybe 50 years ago. Somebody interviewed him. He described World War II as a psychic epidemic.
Go ahead, Max.
Another question. I wonder to what extent we should think of what Jung is saying a little bit in his historical context, the Second World War, but also there was a fascism in Italy, National Socialism in Germany, and then Bolshevism. He hated Bolshevism, and he hated all these forms of masses, and he thought it was a kind of almost a pathology. So, but the point is not is a judgment on these political expressions or manifestations, which sometimes are very different. I'm not the one who put together under the big umbrella of totalitarianism everything. But in any case, the question is to what extent he actually was looking for a form of a rebalance of this tension between the individual and the collective. And since at the beginning of the 20th century, the pendulum of history, let's say, was going in that direction, big crowd, masses, mobs, and public manifestations, squares full of people, it was trying to compensate by emphasizing the importance, the priority of the individual in order to balance the process. So what I'm saying is that maybe what he is writing is not just an analysis or a diagnosis, is also a kind of an attempt to intervene in the form of a prognosis. What we need is rebalance this tension between individual and collective. If what I say makes sense, I think we should think of our present, in which I think we have a very little collective, actually, if we, because I don't know, and we have a lot of individualism. I don't know, we can talk about that, but I think our present is a kind of a different, even this a fragmentation of reality that is going on in social media, but is an experience in which every single atomistic individual in his private or her private home and private computer can create his or her own reality. But it is a very, very different from what Jung could see at the beginning of the 20th century. So my question is, what kind of balance, psychological balance, do we need now in this tension between individual and collective? How these two terms can be reconfigured?
Well, I think that one of the key words is you said is fragmentation. And just previously, when Lisa drew the parallel with mass and yourself, the atom and the concept of mass is actually probably more linked with the fragmentation, the atomization. And when we speak about individuals, it's not, I think it's not as much the individual, it's individuality itself, but it's isolation that creates the foundation for the creation of this or the evocation of these forces, and there is individual isolation, loneliness that I think is experienced more and more, and goes with that, or go with that many fragmentations. When we think about mob mentality, one of the fragmentation that is happening is a fragmentation of the way we see the world. And maybe Lisa could talk more about that, but in the way we talk about the world. I think in our isolation and our loneliness, we kind of crystallize around specific knowledges or languages that are the reflection of the way we perceive the world. And so it is a phenomenon of fragmentation. It's kind of like this paradoxical thing where we are talking about masses, or we are talking, the reflex is to think about, to oppose to the individual, the collective. But in fact, it's a phenomenon of very much of fragmentation, and it's almost going against the collective, but those are the collective forces that are emerging because of the fragmentation.
Yeah.
So,
I was just going to add to that. I was reading an article about mass loneliness and how isolated people with their computers or their Netflix and their the two main activities, entertainment and consumerism, and the loss of or some of the demise of religion, family, and particularly a place in society, some meaning, some position that you feel you're a human being of worth. And when that is lost, then that's when the mob becomes a replacement for that in people's lives. And what else?
Eileen, I have such an idea that people like to be entertained. And everyone can be lonely. Loneliness is not a big deal. So, but nowadays people are used to be entertained. And the big entertainment they get from social media and TV. And they are not active anymore. Because if you think you can do so many things alone and still together with people, you can run up mountains, you can go for walks with people distanced, but people don't do activities anymore because it's an effort. Majority of stuff is happening online. It's observing, it's not creating. Whatever is created online is not reality. So there is no physical effort. So people are dreamers. They don't know really how to do things. And then they suffer from not having anything. Because if you don't know how to do, if you don't try, you constantly dream. But you have to dream big because you observe people having success, consistent success. Online, everyone has success. Loneliness is a definition because people can, I have such an idea that people can stay alone and still be happy. It's just how much do you need or you believe you need. It's your own belief system, how much you need to be entertained, what you have to do.
I think the loneliness that I was talking about was the loneliness of yourself as a person in the world. And a lot of people have a very narrow place in the world, and it's very lonely in the sense of all the connections that you that you don't necessarily engage with routinely, but they're part of your life, like the church or bowling clubs. There's a book about bowling alone that was written something like 30 years ago, that people in America were losing their connections then, and even more so now. And then the frustration of that is in the sense of a loss of meaning in life, not just being lonely, but the whole thing that holds a person together, a connection of something that they hold worthwhile, and they can hold worthwhile in themselves.
I think, go ahead, Lisa.
I'd like to come back to what Max and Gregory were talking about. And, you know, I think what Jung was, you know, in helping swing the balance and regain a sense of social balance, and also, you know, his whole work is about helping people become more conscious of who they are, more conscious of not just who they are as an individual, but who they are as an individual within the collective. And in doing so, in each one of us becoming more conscious and more ourselves, we are not as pulled in by that mob energy. We can either see it for what it is, or, you know, be able to feel its pull on us, but not just unconsciously give into it. And I think that's still the direction we need to be going in.
We've got a lot here. Yes, indeed, we do. I want to channel us back to mob psychology a little bit. But first, Max, Jung was certainly very much opposed to collectivism, whether it's left or right. However, the alternative to that is, with Jung, is not individualism. And this is a very common problem in Jungian conversations at some points. Jung did in no way support individualism. The advance for Jung is individuation, and here we're stuck against our language problem. But here, you know, the language problem is always going to be with us. Because we're using language that has ambiguity and has paradox. And we all have to deal with the problem, as we would have right here, right now, is to none of the words we are using have completely isomorphic meanings for any of us. And that is to say, you know, how can we say, well, when I say individual, what does that mean to each one of you as individuals? But I think the one key for Jung here that is important to bring to bear is that for Jung, consciousness does not emerge in collective structures. I mean, that's its own radical statement. But consciousness emerges in each one of us. You might say one at a time, but that is not a statement of isolation. It's not, and of course, Gebser would say the danger of atomization, of the atomization of consciousness, which can even and unconscious atomization. And even as Elena rightly, valuably brings in entertainment, the cinemasthetics, and all of the media considerations that we have to bring into all of this, as we have been doing. But I'd like to move us on to the next quote, just to keep us going, because I think we again, our specific task is mob mentalities this evening.
John, can I ask you a question?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Instead of going to the third citation, can we go back 1 second to the first citation and just the first line? And I wonder if we can, with or without Jung, reread the first line in a different way. This is almost against Jung, I am aware. When the collective is regarded as a reservoir of psychic possibilities, and Jung disagrees. So what if the collective is a reservoir of psychic possibilities? And we started thinking that if the issue is how to balance today, not at the beginning of the 20th century, where a lot of people were thinking that the new man will be generated by masses in the collective. But today, in the 21st century, we have to think how to rebalance the relationship and the tension between individual and collective. And then we can start thinking that the collective may be a reservoir of psychic possibilities. And we take the risk of that. So, because I didn't say anything when you first asked about possible experience, because I didn't want to say anything. Let me say just this now. This is something that I found myself in some of these events. Something that I shared with other people is an interesting, ambivalent feeling. On the one hand, you feel like a form of, I don't know how to say, a kind of a implementation of your power. You feel that you can do everything because you are part of this mass. On the other hand, simultaneously, you feel a relief because you don't have to take care of your ego. So basically, in the experience that you disappear, there is a sense of relief. It's not only amplification or inflation of the ego, but it's also the opposite. It's the disappearance of the ego, and that gives you relief. Because in a certain way, you are relieved from the burden of being an ego.
Hannah Arendt said that.
Yep.
Yeah.
As you're saying that, I have to say, yeah, just take another view of Triumph of the Will, Leni Riefenstahl's film, and your point is very well taken. I mean, importantly taken. The relief from Bewusstseinsspannung, from the tension of consciousness, the tension of being conscious, which I think everybody in this call would say, yeah. There's tension. There's just tension of being alive, of being conscious, and to seek ways out of that, whether entertainment or spectropoetics or various other fantasy options. But there's where to say the collective regarded as a reservoir of psychic possibilities. It is a gargantuan force, but I think there's where your statement is coming in, Max, is to say, it doesn't have to be a force that fosters grandiose delusions and mass psychoses. That's not the only possibility. And that's a part of what we're talking about here, is how can we be more conscious of the unconscious and of the collective unconscious, Let's roll to the third citation. Eileen, you want to do it again? Somebody else want to do it?
Okay, well,
And then we can actually roll right on, read number 3 and number 4, because I'm keeping an eye on our time. Yeah, read number 3 and number 4. And then the 5th one is will be our pièce de résistance.
the psychology of a large crowd inevitably sinks to the level of mob psychology. If therefore I have a so-called collective experience as a member of a group, it takes place on a lower level of consciousness than if I had the experience by myself alone. We are constantly living on the edge of a volcano. Didn't I read that before?
No, you didn't.
We are constantly living on the edge of a volcano, and there is, so far as we know, no way of protecting ourselves from a possible outburst that will destroy everybody within reach. It is certainly a good thing to preach reason and common sense, but what if you have a lunatic asylum for an audience or a crowd in a collective frenzy? There is not much difference between them because the madman and the mob are both moved by impersonal, overwhelming forces.
So before we get into, any kind of political situation, let's look at an example from history that I think is safe, and that's the rite of spring and the response that it generated. The production by Stravinsky and Nijinsky basically started a riot in Paris, and it brought up something from the unconscious that at least some individuals were unable to control, which spread through the crowd, and caused literally a riot at the theater. I think I brought that up because we can then make an analogy to some of the situations here in the U.S. But that was art, so I'm thinking it's a little safer to start with.
But what this piece of art did was to probably play the role of a catalyzer to basically point at something that was already happening in terms of loss of identity, of social identity, to make someone or crowds or groups of people sensitive to mass reactions. There must be some sort of loss of emotional bearings linked with the realization that something is collapsing, and at a not necessarily conscious level, and then there is a chain of events that propels people into some sort of collective activation. And the loss of bearing, of social bearing, is basically quickly found again into the whatever mob mentality has to offer.
just to make one link there, you know, are we not? Do we not do well to bring in Nietzsche's Dionysian forces? And again, we're traveling back to the late 19th and early 20th century. But how does this connect with us today? In some ways, even more so. So I'll just lay that out there in terms of the Dionysiac, but then also, you know, which is also to say archetypal. You know, if we're to have a Jungian conversation, we're going to bring at some point in again, what are the archetypal patterns that we might recognize or describe in the frenzy, in the self-destruction, in masochism? What is the archetypology of masochism as much as sadism?
Well, one of the archetypal pattern that is very strong, maybe as strong as you know, if we think about anthropological structures like the hero cycle and like these very strong things that we can call archetypal. One of the big anthropological structure or archetypal pattern is the clanic pattern. This is the clanic. I don't know if this is even an English word. To belong to a clan, to belong to a group, is something that is fundamental to us in itself. It doesn't go away. It is who we are. And maybe one of the question is actually, is it efficient or deficient?
Well, we can bring Gebser back in here to say there are structures here of mythic character as well as magical quality that can be fiercely destructive and also powerfully creative. So we have creation and destruction. If we're talking about mob mentality, and I don't know, are you raising the question, Max, in various contexts of what about if a creative mob, or what about the creation that issues from a mob outburst? I mean, if we look through history, and specifically American history, you know, the American Revolution was an extremely violent occasion. Much more violent. I mean, I have a whole treatise in here on the violence of the American Revolution. I mean, it was not a polite little skirmish. And well, then we can take up revolution at large. You know, when does the mob serve the purpose of the tribe or the clan or the group, or however that tribe or clan or group may define itself? In various circumstances. I mean, this is also not even yet to mention the French Revolution and the powerful differences between the French Revolution and the American Revolution, which you have, well, no, Max, you speak to that. You speak to that. Gregory, you've also spoken to that. But let's just do, for the moment, draw back to, for Gebser, of course, we're talking about energies that can be efficient or constructive, creative, that can also be deficient or destructive. And yet it's not as if one side is going to win out, that there's only going to be the creative, efficient side that will overcome and conquer the deficient, destructive side. This is going to lead us deeper into Jungian psychology, particularly with Dr. Sabina Spielrein, and that is destruction as the source of coming to be. And then when we get into the archaic, where there's no differentiation between creation and destruction. So we are constantly living on the edge of a volcano, Jung says, and I would say I feel that is a true statement, as true as when Jung said it. And there's no way, so far as we know, of protecting ourselves from a possible outburst that will destroy everybody within reach. I mean, I don't know what's going to happen in Ukraine. I don't know what's going to happen here, there, anywhere. You know, I used to be into peace and love and granola. It doesn't seem so feasible anymore. It is a good thing to preach reason and common sense. But then Jung is just setting a context for us here. But what if you have a lunatic asylum for an audience? I mean, Jung is just talking to us here. This is not academic prose, or a crowd in a collective frenzy. So we back to the Dionysian. There is not much difference between them because the madman and the mob are both moved by impersonal, overwhelming forces. How do we recognize and describe these? And then I'm looking at you, Paul. Paul Reitman is with us there, and Paul is later going to present to us the work of René Girard. And I don't know, I don't want to call on you, Paul, because you might not want to speak spontaneously. But Girard is the philosopher of violence, to state it glibly, and the intrinsic character of violence. If you're speaking, Paul, you have to unmute, but I'm not putting you on the spot.
There is so much that we've brought up tonight that Girard talks about in various ways that I'm finding it difficult to take one piece of it and follow down that road because the road is so enormous. But I would say that what you've brought up tonight, what everyone has brought up tonight, has been extremely fruitful for me personally, because there are many connections that I see now between the work of Jung and Girard that I hope to bring up in November in more detail with Girard.
With Gibson, it's leading us to an encounter with the archaic, and that is those impersonal, overwhelming forces that all of us experience in either nascent or latent form. And with Girard and others, this and there's the Jungian analyst Wolfgang Giegrich, whose treatise is called Soul Violence, and he says that it is through violence that we come to consciousness at all, because it raises the entire dimension of ethos and morality and values. For Giegrich, I'm just using this as an example here. The very consciousness of being conscious is when we realize we have the power to destroy.
John?
One thing in response to that, John, with Girard, it's very similar to the person you were just talking about, because for Girard, the founding murder, which is a major concept, is the foundation of all of human civilization and culture. So in a certain sense, the founding murder has a double aspect to it. It's incredibly negative, but it's also incredibly fruitful.
We can also, we could say we're speaking mythically, and we're speaking efficiently mythically to say this does matter. It mattered to Kierkegaard, and the mythic matters to Nietzsche as well. It matters to us. Eileen?
Yeah, I don't know if this is out of place here. I think it's not, because Hannah Arendt, in The Origins of Totalitarianism, she wrote about the mob. And I just wanted to read out some of the characteristics that she called as being defining the behavior and the reason to be of the mob. And and she talks about resentment. The mob is ripe for manipulation, and there's plenty to resent in this society here. She talks about impotence and that we basically don't have very much power as citizens. I remember I was being part of the anti-war demonstrations. They were huge, and that about Iraq, and of course it was completely irrelevant. And she talks about the bureaucratic state where you can't even access power to wield except in a mob. And she talks about the mob as being calling always for the strong leader, always for definitive solutions, and the mob always feels excluded, disrespected, and it will be swayed by anti-system movements of any sort, and in a sense, it's she calls it infantile, and that goes along with what Jung is saying, that the mob is not developed or capable; it just rages. And then the last thing, well, there's more, but I just mentioned the last thing. She talks about there's no better way of the mob expressing itself than by hatred for the society from which it's excluded, and that would include ways of getting back at minorities, and she's talking about scapegoating and immigration. Oh, actually, she talks about the people who are displaced. So there's so much of it that is current here, including the loss of the mentation.
That in Gabserian terms, that could align with a deficient mental, deficient mythic, deficient magic, giving rise to archaic rage.
Right.
But Elena, your hand is up.
Yes, I have a question for you, John. I found it interesting, as you said, we get conscious as we start understanding that we have a power to destroy. Is it equally the same, we get conscious as we start understanding that we have the power to create? Because I believe in the create and not destruction. I mean, I found it so interesting. Why is it destruction and not creation, which achieves consciousness?
Well, we've got several seminars seated here tonight. We should be busy for the next few years. Both, and as Lisa would say, but in a recent Jung group discussion I had on the spirit and psyche, the great British psychiatrist D.W. Winnicott was brought in quite a lot. And I'm a big fan of Winnicott, although Winnicott had no regard for Jung at all. But Winnicott really is a profound psychiatric studies of human development. And he actually worked with children, directly with children. And I have found this element, which is how I would shape my response to you. And for Winnicott, one of the most important phases in child development for each one of us, Winnicott will say, universalizing, is when we discover that we have the power to destroy the object. And here in the object relation psychology, this specifically means the child's ability to destroy the mother. The father's part of the mother field. But the child to say, I destroy you, mother, I defy you, I destroy you, I direct all my rage at you, none of that put in such coherent mental statements, all of it actually sort of precognitive in many ways. But then for Winnicott, when the child does this, to have a mother, or the mother field again, the total environment, strong enough to say, okay, child, you did destroy me, but I am still here. Then that leads to what's called the depressive position, which is, well, I guess I can live with this compromise. I thought I had destroyed you, and I don't know what that would have led to, but at any rate, I see that we have to move to a new phase of consciousness now, and we have to have a compromise. And then now I can be creative because we've settled that destructive moment. Well, that's sort of the state of the art in developmental object relations psychology. That and Paul, somewhere in here, this would be a psychological avenue to connect with Girard somehow. But that is, again, our human potential to find that in our power of destruction, we find our power of creation. Or it can go the other way. In the power of creation, we find our power of destruction, and thus we rise, I don't want to use a spatial metaphor, Mike, thus we emerge into a consciousness, a new consciousness. But, and if you will, just keeping an eye on our timing, I don't want to preclude any reactions, but to go ahead and take our final citation, which can lead to bringing up everything we've done and seeing where that leads us before 9 o'clock Pacific.
Well, before we go there, I want to just note how we are acting out that child-mother relation with regard to our Earth Mother right now. And I think Max was waving his hand earlier. Yeah.
No, just okay. I think this relationship between creation and distraction, I think, is a critical. And my question is, what if we change our perspective and instead of looking at the mass from the point of view that is usually a kind of a liberal, almost aristocratic point of view of people like Le Bon that inspired Freud, Arendt, even Adorno in the Frankfurt School. So they basically say the same thing about masses because they see in the mass a danger, and the danger is the fact that the mass is undermining the modern individual. So if we look at what you say, John, this relationship between creation and distraction, what if individuals are so attracted by masses and they want to jump in the ocean of masses just in order to destroy themselves? Why? Because something is there. So we are looking for a new individuation. We are looking for a new configuration and balance of this relationship between individual and collective. Nobody knows where this new balance can be found. And the way to go is just in a self-distraction in the masses. So in a certain way is you go in the masses in order to regenerate yourself, in order to destroy yourself. Obviously the masses is a place of violence and can be destructive against something else. But I would say, let's try to focus for a moment psychologically in the violence that the masses, the violence that each individual in the masses suffers in terms of the self-destruction, and I don't know. I'm thinking, what is so appealing of being in the masses? and both individually and collectively.
Well, self-destruction could be akin to loss of ego, akin to a flow experience. I mean, those are all sort of, like different octaves.
What
I
might be
would
the
just quickly, John, to say there are probably millions of gatherings where we are in groups, and very few kind of go wacko and over the edge of the volcano, right?
yes, we're looking at this tension here. This again, I love the German as well as I can pronounce it. Bewusstseinsspannung. Max, you can tutor me. But consciousness tension, which came from the phenomenologist, I can't remember his name right now, Lisa.
Schutz? Was it Schutz or Luckman?
Schutz. Yeah, Schutz. But here, I was just reading an article on masochism, and I'm also doing my never-ending studies of the First World War and the 20th century. But I mean, the First World War was a massive display of self-destructiveness. But there were values at play. That made folks willing by the millions to sacrifice, to embrace their own destruction. I think in archetypally, we are looking at a yearning for transcendence. And as wherever it came up earlier, a release from the tensions of being conscious in the world today. But I think let's go to the last citation. I think that will escort us to our 9 o'clock hour. So Eileen, are you going to play reader again?
Oh, sure. It is though the psyche were the indispensable instrument in the reorganization of a civilized community, as opposed to the collectivities which are so much in favor today, with their aggregations of half-baked mass men. This type of organization has a meaning only if the human material it purports to organize is good for something. But the mass man is good for nothing. He is a mere particle that has forgotten what it is to be human and has lost its soul. What our world lacks is the psychic connection, and no clique, no community of interest, no political party, and no state will ever be able to replace this.
Those are Jung's italics. So Jung is bringing us to psyche. What our world lacks is the psychic connection. And no clique, no community of interests, no political party, and no state will ever be able to replace this. Now, this comes from his work, Civilization and Transition. And if you really would like to dig further with what Jung has to say, for better and for worse, and also Jung's own limitations and culpabilities and mistakes, Jung's mistakes, you'll find it all in the volume Civilization and Transition. So he's saying here, it is as though the psyche were the indispensable instrument in the reorganization of a civilized community. So rather than looking at collectivities, cultural collectivities, and then of course he's not mincing his words, aggregations of half-baked mass men, shall we say, atomized. But then look at the paradox of the next statement. This type of organization has a meaning only if the human material that purports to organize is good for something. So the type of organization would be an affirmation, apparently, of collectivity or as an organizing principle. But he said it's only good for something with the psychic connection. The mass man who has no psychic connection, and we're just going to allow the masculine pronouns, he is a mere particle, a fragment that has forgotten what it is to be human and has lost its soul. So we're face to face here with the reality of soul. And that's the analytical psychology of C.G. Jung. And
what does he mean here by psychic connection?
What a good question.
Yes.
And in some ways, Jung tells us the core issue in a variety of ways, in lots of his ways. The problem is psyche and matter. And of course, Jung rejects materialism and finds that that's the epochal change occurring in about the year 1950. And we could go into that. And that is resolving the consciousness tension between psyche and matter. What is that tension? How do we describe it? And this brings us to encounter ourselves individually, but also socially and culturally, economically, politically. I mean, what are political disputes about? What are wars about? And we've had continuous war for over a century now. And there are folks, of course, who say war is a good thing. Keeps things organized, establishes hierarchies of values, brings the opposites into sharp focus, and satisfies the yearning for sacrifice and for blood sacrifice. This is the wide, wide, wonderful world of Jungian psychology. Psychic connection. What is the psychic connection? Are we experiencing that right now?
No.
Well, who are we? My dog has got to come in. I've got to go get the dog.
The dog wants psychic connection as well.
Yeah, there's a connection.
Psychic connection.
Hi, Harley.
He does not, at a point, he doesn't want to be left out any longer.
Psychic connection.
Well, psychic connection, I mean, is this not it's from our psychological view, from the Jung view, from analytical psychology, and the spiritual view? I see. Do we experience the reality of soul, or is that no longer a part of the mindset?
It's no longer the mindset.
If we do take soul to be real, then we say, what are we talking about? The long-term problem is, well, we can't identify soul and matter. We can't measure it empirically. There are no metrics here. Indeed, there's no systematization that is adequate, as Jean Gebser would say. If you're looking for ultimate systematization to disclose the wholeness, you're barking up the wrong tree. I put that metaphor in for Harley's sake. But then also, I mean, tomorrow night, Jeff Keel is doing his presentation with the Vancouver group, and please sign up. I mean,
Well, just an idea coming to mind. Just it's everything you just said, and the link with soul, and there is something that echoes with the concept of the idol and idolatry, objectification of the world. And what is this objectification? What is idolatry? If it's not refusing to acknowledge the mystery, or in other words, to acknowledge the otherness of the world that surrounds us. As soon as we stop acknowledging or accepting this otherness, what we cannot apprehend, we lose the connection with what is bigger than us. You can talk about the soul, you can talk about something beyond, and you resort to something simpler, something easier, an object that you can hold in your hand, and that object can be an idea, and hence the link with the mobs, the clinging to the mob is clinging to an easy object that you can apprehend and thus belong to, sort of ersatz, sorts of replacement for what you have been disconnected from.
Right, and didn't Nietzsche say something like that about religion?
What?
Ideologies.
your comment is too ambiguous, I feel, Lisa, for me to grok what you're saying.
Mhm.
What did Nietzsche, tie more in there? Nietzsche said what about what in what way?
The wanting to feel connected to something greater than oneself, which at the same time, and this gets back to what we were talking about earlier, which allows one to lose oneself within it. But also, in so doing, one loses one's power. I can't think of the exact quote that I'm, that's like right there, but not. One of his quotes about religion. Sorry, I can't quite make.
Well,
every
he
single...
he did say God is dead. I suppose that's a religious statement.
Yeah,
No, it wasn't that one.
He said we killed him.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
But
That's right.
But what are we to make of the psychic connection that's going to replace the mob or mitigate mob-like behavior? Will people speak to this psychic connection? Because it's Gregory did, and I understood it to an extent. You can understand something that's by definition not understandable. It's beyond our ken. But how can that mitigate the circumstances of, or change the behavior, or make you not behave that way of a mob, unless you have something like organized religion, because the other part is too like new, maybe, I mean, it's too like meditation, yoga, new agey. How are we to make it as powerful as it is supposed to be? When we can't agree on it, we just say it's a mystery. But does the mystery have power to move people except in an organized way? Through religion, I mean.
Religion doesn't go away. What has changed, I mean, official religion goes away. The traditional way, the traditional transcendence and organized way of connecting went away, but religion takes other forms that are not necessarily labeled. I mean, it can take or the current scientism that it can be associated with the definition of a religion. But I don't know where I wanted to go. I lost it.
You probably wanted to say that religion gets a new face, a new kind of like new makeover.
Hey, Max.
Yes, yes, and I think that the point, yes. So here it is. The point is that we are the very practical point in the disconnection is that we are losing our ability to connect, and primarily we are losing our ability to connect with each other. This is from a very practical standpoint what's happening, for different causes. I mean, it's again the myth of the Tower of Babel. We are all more and more talking in different tongues. This is the disconnection. The world is exploding in a multitude of facets through knowledge, through disciplines, through science, through the reconfiguration of the lost mainstream way of connecting, and also because of this ongoing objectification, this separatedness from the subject and the object. We are with consciousness expanding and with science and disciplines propagating and progressing. The flip side is that we experience this loss of connection, and I think one of the phenomena, one of the response to that is the formation of other structures that may be deficient, such as mobs of all kinds, and their main characteristic is to keep to survive by keeping everything that is outside of the mob defined as other. And this then is reinforced by inner characteristics such as specific language, specific way of doing things, specific way to relate, and hence the fragmentation. So it's kind of like a vicious circle.
We're at 9 o'clock, but Max, let's hear from you. And if there are other closing comments, we always do try to observe our 9 o'clock, but we don't have to slam the door shut.
And very quickly, no, I agree with what Gregory just said. I just want to go back 1 second to Nietzsche's Zarathustra. And I think we have to keep in mind that Zarathustra failed. At the end of the book, he realized that he has followers. And this is a fail, and that means he failed. And he goes back in isolation on the mountain. So what is the point? What is my reading, if I remember correctly, is that the Übermensch, or the Superman, or whatever is the English translation of the term, cannot be taught. There is no way we can taught how to be an Übermensch. So for our conversation, I think, is there is no meditation, no new age way, no book that can redeem us, nothing. I think the thing is that we can only deal with the messy things. And in a certain way, we have to walk at the edge of the volcano and try not to fall into the volcano, but this is the thing. And we have to deal with the messy phenomenon because if as I said before, if it's true, or maybe not, that we are looking for a new balance of this relationship or tension between individual and collective, we don't know the outcome. And maybe it's a good thing that we don't know the outcome, because it opens up a huge field of experimentation that is also very risky. Shitty things can happen in that experiment. But I think, the Übermensch cannot be taught. There is no way we can learn from a book where to go and how to go.
So we're talking about holding it's not holding the opposites, it's holding the tensions that are multiple and ever increasing, managing to do that in this new world, and finding a way, or maybe a method, or a way of life that, or narratives that would motivate us to increasingly hold stronger tensions.
Which is going to be required very rapidly and continually for the next several decades, as the full effect of climate change becomes more manifest and accelerates.
Right.
So the socio-cultural consequences and so forth, and psychological. But you had a New York Times reference, Lisa. What about? And of course, there's increasing registerings of widespread anxiety, particularly in younger demographic groups, and almost, I don't want to throw this word at it, but almost nihilistic dread and despair. Coupled with that, then, is a regression, as Jung said when we started, an effort to go to something simpler, to find a status quo, or an imagined status quo, a status quo that was never real to begin with, but a flight into that fantasy. Well, anyway,
yeah,
this is...
Could you put it, remember in our conversation, John, earlier today, you talked about that in terms of McLuhan's tetrad?
Yeah, well, McLuhan's tetrad, which Lisa's showing there, and again, I'm a devotee of Marshall McLuhan, but McLuhan speaks in terms like this, that in change, how do we experience change? Well, we experience a sense of everything that has been established, shall we say, a status quo for the moment. Then, and he focuses on technology, and why not? Technology changes or enhances the status quo. Our Zoom session is an enhancement. It makes it possible for us to communicate with complete disregard to space, and increasingly right now with disregard to time. So that enhances our situation. It also obsolesces, therefore, the old Monterey friends of C.G. Jung that will never exist again. And that is a group of people sitting around the table, having crackers and maybe a glass of wine. And then there could be a yearning to say, well, we don't want to lose that. We want to continue to have our meetings in our place, and we want to be in time space. We want to touch and smell each other. So we don't want to lose that. Well, how do we work with what has been obsolesced or retrieve it, as I call it, an effort for retro retrieval, to hang on to the values you don't want to lose and that are experienced as loss, as the psychologist Boss puts it, ambiguous loss. She identifies as a major phenomenon in our world, loss that's very hard to define. But then that inevitably, however, for McLuhan leads to a crisis point, or in chaos theory, we could say a homoclinic point, where there is a field figure reversal because you can't go back. You can't go back and restore a past that never was. And we get into the temporics, Mike. But at any rate, then through the crisis comes restructuration. A restructuring. And as you say, Max, I would say if we're going to look at collective terms, are we talking about collectivities now, or are we talking about individualities now? But there's a restructuring, and we don't know what will become of us. Jung is offering us some tools and some suggestions. In the language he's using, he's saying loss of soul is generally experienced as a sickness, a psychopathology, or a psychosis. To use that language, a mass psychosis, Jung says, is what was experienced in the 20th century. I don't know how we could begin to even bring various categories into play now in the third decade of the 21st century. And then, as always, but we are past our time. We want to honor that. But I always think of my grandchildren. I will be a memory to them. If I continue to live a while longer, I'll be a memory even to my youngest grandchild. But who was Granddaddy, and what did Granddaddy have to say, and what did Granddaddy believe in, and how did Granddaddy choose to live? I think of that because I experience myself as their memory now, and I wonder. But I'll make my stand, and I appreciate everyone here again, and all of us in the Monterey Friends. We're very grateful for everyone who connects and does connect. There we go. Gregory, you were characterizing atomization, fragmentation, dissolution, dispersion, dissociation, mass dissociation. We didn't even use that term tonight. We could have. But then here we are, forming wholenesses, even in the midst of unanswerable questions.
We do, and as I was brainstorming earlier, we do because it's who we are. We do form groups, and we need this connection, and maybe the deficient side of it that we have been hinting at in a dotted way tonight. Is this lack of or this loss of meaning, and this is probably a deficient aspect that makes the mobs and makes all this challenging. We speak about the fake today, and the fake news, or the alternative truth. It's linked with where we are. I mean, the postmodernism and all of that. But there is a point where in previous talk, it was probably like 2 or 3 years ago, we talked about, I think that was you, Max, speaking about the authority and the need for authority, not the authority in the mundane way like we hear in the media, but the authority as the what genuinely holds truth and the ability for people, for us, to utilize a language that doesn't say A is A and at the same time it's opposite and it's still true. No, things are a way or another. We can discuss the relativity of things, but I think something we're struggling with, especially with media, especially with and John would speak about the speed of the propagation of communication and all your synesthesia ideas. It's the George Orwell thing, 1984. If some sort of group of people manage to convince people that things are the same, are what they are and they're opposite at the same time, then we can do anything. And it's I think it's what we are struggling with. And when we mention the mobs and this challenge, it's beyond our craving for belonging. It's about this deficient side of managing to belong to something that has lost its meaning and thus that is deficient.
Mhm.